All right. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the B-Sides I'm the Cavalry track. If you are still talking, please exit the room. Unless you are this gentleman here, Richard Manning. This is the certification and labeling of IoT. I'd like to go ahead and do a few quick announcements here. One, our sponsors. We would like to thank our sponsors, especially our Inner Circle sponsors. That's Critical Stack and Valley Mail. And a couple of our stellar sponsors, Secure Code Warrior, Paranoids, and the NSA. Thank you all very much. Without their sponsorship and so many others, including the help of the volunteers, this would not be possible. So thank you. Another reminder, cell phones, please turn off your cell phones during this talk. It is streamed, so we do need you to go ahead and mute those right now. Thank you. Without further ado, Richard.
Thank you. So hi, I'm Richard Manning from the NCSC in the UK. Thanks for having me today. So I'm going to be talking to you briefly about the work the UK and to a degree the Europeans are doing on IoT security and certification, what we're doing now, and potentially where you can help us in the future. Bit of background to myself to getting here today. I've only been involved in this project directly for the last 3 months. Somebody asked me, do you want to help on IoT? I said yes, and here I am. So I've had a lot of help from colleagues, Paul, a colleague Peter, who was going to come and present today, but unfortunately he couldn't make it because of an illness, and David Rogers, who presented on this with Bo last year. So they've all helped me understand this. So therefore, if you've got any really technical questions, I'm going to bat them off to my colleagues back in the UK, but I'm happy to answer questions at the end if need be. Now, David actually got an MBE from the Queen to Service to Cyber earlier this year, so I'm fingers crossed. I'm hoping this presentation does the same for myself. So a bit of background, the NCSC, who are we? So we are the National Cyber Security Centre in the UK. Now, prior to the NCSC, there were lots of different departments and agencies in the UK all doing something in the world of cyber or computer security, as we all want to call it properly. And we all had very confusing names like CSG, CPNI, OCP, where the C and the S meant cyber or security or computers or something like that. Described by various seniors and stakeholders in the UK as an alphabet soup of team names. So back in 2016, we formed the NCSC as one unit to take on responsibility to be the technical authority for all things cyber in the UK. And our main headline aim is to make the UK the safest place to live and work online. And that underpins basically everything we do in the NCSC. So what about myself? What do we do? So I work for a part of NCSC called Economy and Society. And our focus is to enable all UK people and organisations to be less vulnerable and more resilient. That's a pretty broad remit. And we don't use one technique to achieve those aims. We offer a range of guidance, tools, services, bespoke engagements to try and sort of deliver that. Feel free to go to our website. Lots of guidance and tools and stuff there. Obviously, it's UK specific, but a lot of the broad underpinning science behind it is applicable anywhere, and the stuff you can download and use as you see fit. As well as guidance and things like that, we also get involved behind the scenes with various policy and standards, of which I'm going to come on to in a second in relation to IoT. But we know this isn't a silver bullet. We know that there isn't one thing that's going to make everything secure, otherwise we'd have all done it by now. But it's one thing that should hopefully make the world a better place when it comes to IoT security. So during this session now, I'm going to give a brief recap of what we've done in the past in relation to IoT security in the UK, the work we're currently doing, and some of the work we're doing within Europe around standards. And finally, I'm going to be talking about our next stages, what we're doing in regards to legislation, further standards, and further working. And there's some questions there that you might want to get involved in further down the line. So previously, what have we done? So last year, we published the UK Code of Practice on IT security, which I'll come on to in the next slide. Now that basically had 13 points, and 3 that would make up what we call the baseline. These are effectively no default passwords, a vulnerability reporting methodology, and a defined end of life for a given product. Now that was developed with extensive input from the wider community. Josh and Bo are involved with that early on as well. And hopefully there's a general theme that matches lots of other standards around the UK will become apparent. Now, David Rogers presented on this last year and has been doing the same thing around the world. My colleague Peter presented on this at RSA, an event at RSA earlier this year. So we're trying to continue that engagement with the wider community to try and sort of make sure that what we're doing isn't completely out of sorts with the rest of the world. And we know from the news stories that IoT security still hasn't been fixed, so we're still doing stuff there. It's always in the news, so we're going to continue onwards. So as I just mentioned, last year, on the left-hand side there, we produced the Code of Practice. It was delivered by a department called DCMS, Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, also known as the Ministry of Fun in the UK. That's available online. Please feel free to download it. It's been translated into numerous languages as well, so you can read it in any language you really feel like it. We published that last year. Then earlier this year, we started a consultation on what to do for the next stages. So we produced this guidance, what can we do next? And we asked broadly 3 sets of questions. The first set were about the type of approach we could take and the type of labelling scheme that we're proposing. We also asked some questions about what would the impact be if we did those things. And finally, we asked a question about how we could enforce such a proposal. Now, we've got some really good feedback on that. The feedback closed earlier about sort of a few months ago. 50 plus organisations came back to us, which incorporated most of the big trade bodies in the UK, most online and domestic sort of high street retailers that deliver consumer IoT devices. We're currently reviewing that feedback with the aim of producing a paper highlighting what we found out at the end of this year. But what I can do now is quickly detail some of the core findings, the key further points. 2 big stats there, which are quite useful. 84% are in favour of us focusing on this baseline. Those are the highlighted points in the middle there, which is quite handy because that's where we want to start really. So they're broadly in line with what we want to do. 96%, which I think is quite a significant score, are in favour of government regulation in this space. What it doesn't show you is that there's lots and lots of disparity in how we regulate. So whilst they're happy with it, they want some sort of regulation, how we do it, where we do it, that's very much up for debate. And different retailers, different manufacturers, all got a different opinion in that there. So other highlights that came out of that consultation, which will be published later on, lots of people were looking for further clarification and definition on the technical terms of IoT. You look in any IoT standard, any website now, nearly everybody defines IoT slightly differently. And if we're going to regulate stuff, we need to sort of try and rally around a shared definition. They want clarification of definition of how we're going to apply legislation. Would it be UK specific? Would it try and sort of go further and overseas? And then there's more detail required on things like the technical implementation of such IoT. Are we talking about devices that can connect directly to the internet? Devices that connect through some kind of hub? Or devices that only become smart or IoT-like via an app? Where's the line being drawn on what we can regulate against? We also had lots of questions around things like passwords. So we say there should be no default passwords, but some IoT devices don't use passwords in the common sense of the word. Like Zigbee devices, there's some implementations which don't use a password as such. They do shared keys and other things like that. Is that the same? Yes, no, discussion. They wanted more definition on what we meant by vulnerability disclosure. Lots of discussions here and during this week about what that actually means in practice. But if we're going to regulate, we need to be clearer on what that actually means. A good question that came up was security updates versus product updates. Again, this is a good indication of the maturity of the market. Lots of people are making things smart that haven't been smart before. Washing machines, toasters. These are companies which have not been involved in any of this kind of industry before, so they don't know, well, they haven't got their heads around in a maturity way of what we mean by this. So we need to be clearer about what we mean by updating software and why would you update a toaster? I mean, once you buy it, it works and off you go. Is that right? We know that's not probably the right answer, but toaster manufacturers, for example, aren't in that headspace yet. Other questions that were raised up were about implementation. If we implemented any sort of rules and regulations, when would they? How would that work? Would there be a voluntary period? Would it be a couple of years of this is what's going to happen and then regulate after 2 years? Lots of questions around supply chain and development chains. A product that you buy in the shops today has obviously had probably a year, maybe 2 years worth of development and delivery time to get to your store. Or where do we regulate? Do we regulate at the retailer's point of sale, or do we regulate a manufacturer? And how does that affect any standards that we put in place? The actual label we're talking about as well. If we start labeling, how is that going to look? How will the consumer understand what the label means? Do we need to use something as basic as, say, a traffic light system? Red, amber, green for different things. How does that work in practice? Another idea was proposed was negative labeling. Do we just promote or do we just talk about the products which don't pass the certification? Arguments to and from for that as well. And then there was also lots of questions about actual sort of assessment. Some companies or some organizations wanted us to push for independent sort of lab-based assessment of products. Some companies were much more pro-favor of self-assertion. Lots of pros and cons for both of those, but those are things up for discussion. And then finally, there was a good question that was raised to us about the top three. Two of the points, vulnerability disclosure and keeping software updated and sort of an end-of-life requirement, they're more policy or procedural requirements. It's very hard to test that. Testing default passwords, you can technically test. You can dive into the code and see if there are any passwords in there potentially. Not so much the other two. But how do you get confidence that they're doing that? Are we going to ask for audits of these manufacturers? How does that work in practice as well? So that's the consultation that's just finished now. The aim of going into some kind of like legislation end of this year, early next year, sorry. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into this too much detail. This is a good indication of, this is a slide I borrowed from my colleagues in DCMS, and it shows this whole willingness to try and ratify or try and move towards a common standard. You see at the top there's an ISO. This is effectively where things could lead to. This is not defined, this isn't necessarily going to happen, but what it shows is that you've got lots of different government agencies in Europe, BSI in Germany and DIN, and different industry groups, different manufacturers, all working together in different groups to try and get a grip of IoT security and how it could affect them. Now, I was at a meeting a few weeks ago where we were trying to merge certain standards together, and whilst, there was lots of discussion about actual specific wording or implementations, the general feeling was, let's all try and do the same things, try and make it easier for manufacturers and consumers to sort of rally around one standard if possible. Otherwise, it gets too confusing. And I'll show you some confusion later on about why it needs to be fixed. But the underlying opinion is, consensus is there. It's just a matter of trying to sort of get it all into one place. So, as I just mentioned, we've done some mapping of the various standards now. It's against the UK Code of Practice, but there's lots of stuff in there which is non-UK specific. And it's a really good example. This paper, linked to the bottom there, is a really good example of how the different IT standards exist and how they interact. David did this for his company. He's done a blog to talk about it. And it was updated this week. Incorporates various changes to the policies and standards we've talked about and how they interact with each other. And as you see in the middle there, lots of people are saying the same things, just in different ways. Good security is good security. You can reword it different ways, but certain things we know are pretty basic and need to be implemented. So recommend you have a look at that report there and see how the different IT standards are working together. We're going to keep updating this report for as long as we need to until there is some consolidation between the different standards. This will still be updated to try and give some classification of what's going on. So leading into what we're doing next. Like I said, we've done this consultation effort to get an understanding of what we're trying to do. We're working with the Europeans to try and sort of rally around some common standards. Our aim is to push for some UK legislation next year. We'll start that ball rolling in government early next year with a white paper and things like that. Now, as you hopefully understand, trying to get policy or some legislation through government is never the easiest thing to do. But we're confident we can get something done next year, depending on who's in power. We're also going to continue to work with the Europeans to, make that a European standard as well. However, as we get closer to certification or legislation, we've still got some questions we need to answer. based on the left-hand side there, we need to understand the manufacturers are delivering what they say they're delivering. They're not just paying lip service to these sort of requirements. We need to understand how to gain confidence in such certification, how to sort of build that into the process so that we know what we're doing. And importantly, we want to make sure that the floor doesn't become a ceiling. This is a phrase that Peter refers to. So we know that the three baseline requirements, they're quite low level. They're quite basic. We knew we couldn't go in there with the full 13 requirements of secure comms and stuff like that. Manufacturers just wouldn't work straight away with that. But we want to keep pushing that bar upwards and trying to make it better for the manufacturers to meet those needs. And to do that, we need to push these two things on the axes here. So we need to make vendors, consumers, different stakeholders. We need to educate them more about the cybersecurity of their devices. Different ways to do that. And down the bottom there, we need to make them care more about cybersecurity. And to do that, there are various methods we can do, carrot or stick, really, and different types of approaches there to be put in place. And eventually, we push the bar higher and higher and higher until we get to the lofty heights of perfect security for IoT, which might take a few years, potentially. So I'm happy to take questions on this if you want to now. I'm also running a discussion about how we achieve these next steps potentially internationally and within EU and UK. A public discussion later on today, if anyone's interested. I'll give a bit more background on what we've said and done and a bit more information about the NCSC and how it relates to us. But thank you very much for this chance to talk to you. And any questions?
I'll come over you with the microphone.
The first bullet point, how can we ensure all manufacturers act responsibly? So is there legislation or is there a governing body that is actually measuring how the manufacturers are complying with these guidance?
So that's the next step, really. Not at the moment, no, there isn't. There could be quite easily, but we're trying to work out what the best approach is to do that. Do we want something independent? Do we want a government-based body, independent labs? There's lots of ways to solve that problem, potentially. Each have their pros and cons. So yeah, that's one of the key points we need to understand how best to do that. There are different standards out there for gaining confidence in products, but are they the right thing for this kind of sector?
This might be jumping into this afternoon's discussion, but how do you anticipate sort of working with ENISA as you know they are looking to sort of implement this new Cybersecurity Act? And my understanding is consumer IoT is going to be one of the early areas that they're looking for certifications there. So how does the NCSC plan to continue?
So we're working with them already, very much so. And we know there's different timescales in play. We also, you might have heard of Brexit. We're not quite sure how that's going to impact all this. So we're working with both camps really to try and make sure that a lot of the common technology, the common requirements are going to be the same. A lot of the stuff in the ENISA stuff is based on what we've done before. We're feeding that up. So in theory, ENISA comes in and that's the bigger thing. We can just point to that and it will still meet our requirements. We might stop doing our requirements. I don't know. Lots of options there, but we are very much tied into that piece of work and support it. It's just they're working at different timescales. So ENISA might take a couple of years. We might do ours in a year. And we're not, personally, from my point of view, I'm not fussed which one gains providence. In the end of the day, I want my consumers to be able to purchase IoT stuff which is secure. But yeah, we're working together quite heavily.
Any more questions? Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you.